Be sure to check out mythvisionpodcast.com. Help MythVision grow, guys. Become a Patreon member. You guys will get early access to all my videos when I'm done editing them. Also, it's a small community where you guys can message me your questions and talk to me in private. You guys can also donate through PayPal and Cash App. Join the social media links down in the description. We have Twitter, Facebook, all sorts of social media. Help the community of MythVision grow. Hit the subscribe button, hit that bell so you guys are notified every time I do a live video and you don't miss any of my content. Dr. Price, our good friend David Samuel has a question and would like to get your thoughts on this. There are various people with various thoughts of the temple cleansing. Jesus is cleansing the temple. First of all, the question ultimately he asks is this a fiction? Were people really cleansing the temple like what is portrayed in the Gospels with Jesus? Could you really have him flipping over money changer tables and lashing people and doing all that? Do you think this account is fiction? And even if it is, let's just say you agree with that it is, what does it mean? What do you think is going on here? Dr. Bob?
Well, I do strongly suspect that it's fictitious. And there are big reasons to think that. For one thing, the scope of the operation, if it happened, Mark does not seem to understand that the court of the Gentiles was bigger than several football fields. How could Jesus have, what could he have done? We usually think of this as if it's like a rummage sale in a church basement with card tables with the old Reader's Digest books on it and stuff like that. And Jesus comes in and starts overturning things. I mean, that would cause a little ruckus, but it would be a tempest in a teapot. That's a big problem. The story does not seem to understand that. It would be a very different story if they did. Another thing is there were armed guards in the temple, the temple police, especially at Passover time when they figured Elisha would return and the Messiah would come, and so they had extra guards posted. One would think for just this purpose, in case somebody flipped out and created some sort of a disturbance like this. Why does Jesus not get arrested right then and there? And even for the little ruckus he could create. And of course, the text's implied answer is that they didn't want to risk rioting. But because that's why the Sanhedrin is trying to set him up to arrest him on the sly, so it wouldn't be in public, because if it were, Jesus had enough fans that they wouldn't put up with it and there'd be fighting and all that. That does make sense, but then you got to wonder, why did they ever have any guards there? I guess they figured not everybody was a celebrity like Jesus. But then you kind of got to wonder why they needed Judas or anybody else to point out who Jesus was in the garden afterward. Like I always like to say, which of you guys is Elvis? I mean, they're worried about Jesus because he's so popular, but they need to have somebody point him out? That seems odd and also incompatible with the idea of his notoriety making it dangerous to arrest him in public. Those are problems. Of course, it's always possible that they did arrest him there, and the Last Supper and all that stuff has been added to the story. That's fictive, who knows? But these are improbabilities that seem to affect the story, whatever follows it. Okay, also, you got to ask yourself why Jesus would do this. Is there anything in the Gospels that would issue in this? Jesus doesn't polemicize against the temple. There's this ambiguous saying about destroying the temple and it being replaced by another one not made by human hands, which is sort of implies, like in the book of Revelation, the New Jerusalem descending from the heavens. And it looks like the Essenes believed in something like that. They boycotted the temple because they felt that the priests in charge were not doing things right. They were on the wrong calendar, so they weren't, this, what is it? This is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. How did he make it? Well, he appointed certain feast days. And if you're doing it on the wrong day, you can't be pleasing God. And they figured that they were, because it's a big thing about you're going to use the solar calendar or the lunar calendar, how many days of the week and all of the year. So, yeah, there were people that thought that God would replace this temple with a new one, but we don't hear that they were trying to go in and bomb the place. They just had their own ceremonies off campus, you might say. So what was he trying to do? Like in the trial of Jesus, people, it says, paid witnesses lied and said, oh, we heard this guy say that I'm planning to blow up the temple like Madonna with the White House. Who's with me? And as this, but they couldn't even get their story straight. So even the Sanhedrin says, get these guys out of here. That's... But then John says Jesus did say it, but he meant the temple of his body would be destroyed and raised up in 3 days. Then Luke ignores it, but has Stephen accused of saying it, but by false witness. Jesus of Nazareth will come back and destroy this place. So what's the deal there? That's a problem with it.
That's a great question.
And then, so what was he trying to do? A teacher of mine, Michael Kogan, suggested that when Jesus says, he quotes Isaiah, "My temple shall be a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it into a robber's cave," from Jeremiah. Well, he says, a place of prayer, that's a synonym for a synagogue, as in Acts. Paul goes to Philippi and finds a place of prayer at the riverside, an informal synagogue. So did Jesus want to end sacrifice and make the whole temple a synagogue, a house of prayer and teaching? I don't think there's any real reason to think that. Of course, Jesus is being fed lines from the Bible there. Everything he says is from a direct quote from Isaiah or Jeremiah, and so you got to wonder, did Jesus just say that? And as Bultmann says, who remembers the great man quoting somebody else? So that's problematical. Was Jesus, as I think E.P. Sanders and others say, was Jesus doing this as a kind of an anticipatory signal for the coming destruction of the temple by Rome if Israel did not repent of its sins? That strikes me as really silly, because who would draw such an inference? Who would think, oh my gosh, the temple's going to be destroyed because this nut is causing a ruckus? I don't think so. That seems to me an ahistorical view. The only way this could be true is if Jesus brought in a whole bunch of armed followers, enough to commandeer the gigantic space and to fight off the temple police, maybe enough to call their bluff and have a standoff, but maybe there was violence, because remember, Barabbas is said to have murdered people in the insurrection. What recent insurrection was there? This? Was it that Jesus was leading an armed raid to rob the temple treasury and buy weapons? That's by no means unlikely. Because think of how at the Last Supper in Luke, he says, things are not going to be as easy as they were. When I sent you out preaching, did you lack anything? Oh, no, people took care of us and all that. Well, now I'm telling you, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. And I said, well, Lord, we got two here. And he says, that's enough. Now, what did he mean by that? Did he mean to say, well, we're just going to make a show of resistance so they will have a reason to arrest me because, of course, I have to be killed? And that seems highly contrived. And or did he mean that get ready, we're going to have a fight, which it says they did, right? That a huge armed force, 1,000 men, whatever it is, a company, a squadron, to arrest little old Jesus, and his disciples were armed with only 2 swords. We're not getting the whole story here. It doesn't really make sense given the elements that have survived in it. So maybe what really happened was an assault on the temple, which he managed to escape. Maybe there was more of a clash in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he didn't win, and he was taken prisoner. And maybe that's why the placard above his head on the cross said, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the would-be king of the Jews." People say, well, he must have claimed to have been the Messiah, or why would they even put that up? Well, if it was all a frame-up, as many people think, well, then that's a frame-up too. It's a false accusation. I don't know how they missed that. But let's suppose it really did happen, and Jesus did figure on being the king once this mess was over. Then you've got the zealot hypothesis and all that comes with it. You have to decide where to go from there. The way Reimarus went, or the way Valiant and Fahey go. It's not at all implausible. You have the attempt to exonerate the Romans because you're trying to suck up to them after this all failed, and you don't want to make a big deal of your abandoned radical roots. And that would make some sense. But then it's easy to imagine somebody just saying they got the idea from Scripture, like they apparently did for other things. What did Jesus do? Well, what does it say? I guess he went to Egypt at some point and came out, because Hosea 11:1 said, "Out of Egypt I've called my son." They had no memory of this happening, no tradition. They just figured, like we learn what Jesus ostensibly did from reading the New Testament, they learned it from reading the Old. Well, if Moses did this, multiplied food, Elijah did this, and so on, well, the Messiah is better than them. He must have done it too. He must have. These are prophecies, and it's not at all unreasonable. Strauss said this a couple of centuries ago. So in this case, maybe somebody was looking at Malachi and said, "The Lord whom you seek will come to his temple, and he will purify the sons of Levi. But who can stand when he appears?" Boy, that really came to life when Handel wrote The Messiah, one of those spine-chilling sections of that opera. Well, that's enough, especially with those 2 quotes from Isaiah and Jeremiah. What else happens in it? What else is said in it? It's not much of a story. And so there's various reasons to think either it happened, but it was more than you want to think happened, or it didn't happen. It's just another fake fulfilled prophecy. So I tend to think it didn't, but it might well have, and then you're in the zealot territory.
So one way or the other, you're running into a problem.
Yeah, a huge one.
You can't have a pacifist Jesus going in there if he really existed.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because, just to give you an example, our good buddy Dennis R. MacDonald does believe that the sayings of the logo, or the sayings of Jesus, the logoi, I believe, or logoi, or whatever, however you pronounce it, of Jesus in Q, kind of give Jesus off as a cynic. Mm-hmm. I used the term Stoic. He says, "You mean cynic," is what he meant, and so like a cynic philosopher. But if you have a cynic philosopher doing what that is saying, cleansing the temple, to me it's hard for me to see, like, what are your conclusions on the historical Jesus? Because what is your cynic worried about going in the temple flipping tables over? It makes no sense to me.
Well, actually, you could defend that. I've never heard that question raised, but the cynics were cynical toward conventional religion and trying to show how silly it was. Like, you can read Mark 7 that way with the hand washing and the kosher food and so on. what does Jesus wind up saying? Look, clean food, unclean, it all comes out into the toilet bowl. What's the difference? That's the kind of irreverent, sarcastic thing Diogenes would say. Now, this guy isn't a cynic, but it's a great example of the way they dealt with things. Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikh religion, he was in Benares with a couple of disciples, and they go to the Ganges, and it's a festival day, and there's thousands of people there, and a bunch of the people are bathing, and one group is standing there dishing up water and throwing it into the air, and Nanak says, pardon me, what are you doing, throwing the water up in the air? And they say, oh, we're sending it to our ancestors in heaven. And, oh, thanks. And so he then stands in the water with his back to them in the opposite direction and starts doing the same thing. Hey, what do you think you're doing there? And he says, well, I'm sending the water to water my fields in Lahore. And you're just making fun of us. And he says, well, look, if you can get your water all the way to heaven, I ought to be able to get mine to Lahore. And that's cynicism. What you're doing is bunk, because you have to live with nature by reason. All these headaches you have from your money and your possessions, how can I keep them safe, and who am I going to vote for? Am I going to marry the right person? What about my job? Do animals agonize over stuff like this? Do they have jobs? Do they have bank accounts? Do they worry about this and that? No! Like the lilies of the field and the birds of the air, right? That's Q stuff. Well, that's cynic stuff too. They said the same thing. Or Diogenes getting old and infirm, and somebody said, I hate to bring this up, but maybe you better start thinking about funeral plans. And he says, nah, I figure if I croak, the stench will get me buried. What? That's a big thing in Judaism. He's a Greek, but yeah, what the heck? These rituals are meaningless. And one can see a cynic Jesus saying, you're going to feed God with this stuff. You're going to buy these sacrifices and change the money so you can have the right kind of coins to buy the animal, to kill, to give it to God. God needs leg of lamb. I can't imagine that because they did outrageous things in public to show, hey, look at this. You don't have to live this way, including masturbating in public and sex in public, all kinds of stuff. They were like the hippies. And so I can imagine that if it were just a token stunt, that a cynic might do that.
Interesting. Wow, we just went from rebel to cynic to fiction in one question. Thank you for the question, David Samuel. Love you, man. Thank you so much, brother. Mm-hmm. We look forward to more questions from you.
Yep.